Right now, somewhere in the world, a child is being born with cerebral palsy. And the first question most parents ask is, why did this happen? The second question, the quieter one, is, what happens now? But there is a third question almost no one asks. What would have happened to that child 10,000 years ago? The answer is not what you think. Cerebral palsy is not a disease. It is not contagious. It is not a curse. It is damage to the developing brain, sometimes before birth, sometimes during, sometimes in the first years of life, that affects how a person controls their body. Their muscles receive the wrong signals. Movement becomes difficult. Sometimes speech. Sometimes balance. But the mind behind those muscles? Often completely intact, sharp, aware, fully human. For most of recorded history, people assumed ancient societies had no patience for difference. The logic seemed obvious. Survival was brutal. Resources were scarce. Anyone who could not hunt or gather or run from a predator would simply be left behind, abandoned, forgotten. A tragic footnote in the long story of human evolution. That assumption is wrong. In 1957, an archaeologist named Ralph Solecki made a discovery in a cave in northern Iraq called Shanidar. He found the remains of a Neanderthal man who had lived roughly 45,000 years ago. The man had a withered right arm. His right eye socket showed signs of severe damage, likely leaving him blind on that side. His left leg had a healed fracture, multiple healed injuries, multiple disabilities, and yet he had survived into his 40s. In a world with no medicine, no hospitals, no social safety net of any kind, he had survived because other people took care of him. He was fed, he was protected. He was kept alive long after his body had stopped being useful to the group in any conventional sense. Researchers called this evidence of compassion, real compassion, ancient compassion. The kind that exists not because it is rational, but because something in the human brain reaches toward the vulnerable and says, "You belong here." So what does this mean for a child born with cerebral palsy in the ancient world? The honest answer is, it depended entirely on where and when that child was born. In some ancient societies, children born with visible differences were killed at birth. This is documented in ancient Sparta, where a council of elders inspected newborns and decided which were fit to live. In ancient Rome, the 12 Tables, one of the earliest written legal codes, permitted fathers to immediately destroy a child born with a deformity. These are real historical facts. They are uncomfortable, and they are not the whole picture, because for every Sparta, there is a counter-story. Bioarchaeologist Jane Buikstra spent decades studying ancient skeletal remains across North America and found consistent evidence of long-term care for individuals whose bones showed severe physical limitation. People with conditions that would have made them completely dependent on others. Spines so curved they could barely stand. Limbs that had never developed fully. And yet the wear patterns on their bones, the alignment of their joints, the absence of the kind of damage that comes from neglect, all of it pointed to one conclusion. Someone looked after them. For years. Your ancestors were not all the same. Some were brutal. Some were extraordinarily tender. The condition we now call cerebral palsy would have looked different in the ancient world depending on its severity. A child with mild hemiplegia, weakness on one side of the body, might have moved a little differently, held objects a little awkwardly, but functioned within the group in countless ways, tending fires, grinding grain, telling stories, watching children, weaving, making tools. Contribution does not require running speed. A child with more severe spastic cerebral palsy would have faced a harder road. Unable to walk independently, unable to speak clearly, their survival would have depended entirely on whether the people around them chose to extend care. And here is where the evidence becomes quietly stunning. A 2017 study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science examined the remains of an ancient individual from Bronze Age Vietnam, roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. The individual showed severe physical disability consistent with a condition affecting full limb use from early childhood. and yet they had lived into young adulthood. The researchers concluded that this person had received sustained, intentional care from their community for years, not weeks. Years. This was not an isolated case. Similar findings have emerged from ancient Egypt, from prehistoric Europe, from sites across Asia. People with bodies that could not sustain themselves, kept alive by the deliberate choice of those around them. Why? Why would a group under constant survival pressure spend limited resources keeping alive a member who could not contribute in the traditional physical sense? The anthropologist Kim Sterelny argues that early human groups survived not because they were the fastest or the strongest, but because they were the most cooperative. The groups that outcared their competition survived longer. They pooled knowledge. They protected the weak. They remembered that today's dependent is tomorrow's elder, and tomorrow's elder holds the memory of where the water is when the dry season comes. Caring for the vulnerable was not charity. It was strategy. And over hundreds of thousands of years, it became instinct. There is one more layer to this. In many ancient and indigenous cultures around the world, individuals born with unusual bodies or minds were not seen as broken. They were seen as different in a way that carried meaning. Shamanic traditions across Siberia, the Americas, and parts of Africa consistently describe the shaman, the healer, the spirit speaker, the keeper of sacred knowledge, as someone marked by physical or neurological difference. The seizures that can accompany some forms of cerebral palsy were sometimes interpreted as visions. The atypical movement, the unusual speech, the way a person with cerebral palsy inhabits their body differently. In certain cultures, this was read as evidence of a connection to something beyond the ordinary world. Not every person born with cerebral palsy in the ancient world would have been given this role. Not every ancient culture would have welcomed them. History is not a simple story of progress toward kindness. But the fossil record, the skeletal record, the ethnographic record, taken together, they tell a story that is far more complicated and far more human than the one we assumed. The question was never really, what did ancient people do when someone was born different? The real question is, what did it reveal about them? And the answer, written in ancient bone and the healed fractures of someone who had no business surviving, is this. Some of your ancestors looked at a child who could not run, could not hunt, could not lift a spear, and they chose to carry that child instead. They built their world around a body that did not fit the world's expectations. And because they did, that child grew up, remembered, was loved, was mourned when they died. Right now, a child is being born with cerebral palsy. And the question of what happens next is still, after 45,000 years, entirely up to the people around them.